Okay, I want to talk about how Aristotle's moral philosophy was appropriated and used by Christianity, and something you might be familiar with, especially if you've seen the movie, The Seven Deadly Sins. The Seven Deadly Sins, what we might call the seven capital vices or seven cardinal vices. What happened was Christianity, particularly in the medieval period, used Aristotle's framework of ethics, but also his metaphysics, which we'll talk about later if we have time, to form the basis of a Christian philosophy. And some of you even said that Christianity or Catholicism is nothing more than the growing interaction and eventual fusion between Athens and Jerusalem, or Greek thinking and Hebraic thinking, or Jewish thinking. But anyway, Thomas Aquinas is probably most popular for doing this, but many others have done so, that has used Greek philosophy's approach to ethics to formulate some principles in Christianity. And it came up with, and it used, I should say, the framework of mean, habit, mean between excess and deficiency, habit, context specific, all these things that we've been talking about. It used them to formulate its understanding of sin. So the seven deadly sins, if you know them, are pride, wrath, envy, sloth, lust, gluttony, and greed. And I had to look them up because I was doing a video earlier, but I forgot them, so I had to restart the video. If you notice, all these seven deadly sins, or all these vices, have something in common. They're either an excess or a deficiency of a given emotion. For example, pride is an excess of self-love. And interestingly, both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas much later thinks that all, they both think that all vice, in a certain sense, comes down to the problem of self-love. And therefore, all virtue and the entire moral life, in some sense, is about the regulation of self-love. In the end, all these virtues have self-love at their root. And if a human being can just get self-love or selfishness under control rationally, he or she can be virtuous. But we'll talk about that because that's later in books, in book 9, particularly 9.4 and 9.8. Okay. Or wrath, a seven deadly sin of wrath, an excess of emotion. Envy, excess anger or sorrow at another's success. Lust, excess sexual desire. Gluttony, excess desire for food and drink. Greed, excess desire for material goods. One seven deadly sin, though, however, is strange, doesn't quite fit. It's actually a deficiency, and it's the sin of sloth, which is a very, very interesting sin in the history of Christianity and the history of philosophy, because sloth is, it's depending on who you read when they're discussing sloth, it sounds very different. It actually looks like kind of what we might call today depression. When people describe sloth, what they mean by it, how Thomas Aquinas, for example, defines it. Again, this isn't Aristotle. This is the way in which Aristotle was received into the Christian tradition. But when they talk about sloth, when Thomas Aquinas talks about sloth, he says sloth is apathy toward the good. It's a kind of listlessness. It's sometimes referred to as the noonday demon, because in Psalm 90 or 91, monks who would chant the Psalms all day long. Notice there's the scourge that lays waste at noon in Psalm 90, and monks would experience this. They would get depressed and apathetic and listless when they would go into the desert and just chant the Psalms. They would sort of get what we might call today something like depression. Now, probably not what we might mean by the clinical kind of depression, but it's interesting that in the medieval period, in the ancient period, in the classical period, there was, again, much more responsibility for our emotions, and they even blamed people. I'm not saying this is good, but sloth was this kind of sin that now we tend to think of it as laziness or a kind of apathy. But the way the monks talked about it was something like what we might call depression. And I think you can say this theory of emotions and this moral framework blames people for their emotional states, something we find pretty offensive today. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. It's just something to think about the theory of emotions that is operative in the classical and medieval periods in philosophy, namely a theory where you're responsible for your emotions, even responsible for something like your depression or your anxiety, Aristotle might say. I think that there's problems with that, obviously, but it's just interesting to mention. Anyway, the seven deadly sins are thought of in and through the Aristotelian framework of virtue being a middle position between an excess of emotion and a deficiency of emotion.